For generations, American elites have ignored the common people, average Americans in the working class. It witnessed only the beginning of the National Populist Revolution they unleashed in the 2016 election. The National Populist Newsletter aims to be a source for those part of that movement who care about the state of their country and the trends of our politics, and who look for insight as to how we must examine and fight the culture war. Welcome to the National Populist Newsletter podcast. Hello, my name is Anthony Leonardi. I'm an assistant writer for the newsletter. My co-host is Nate Hockman, a Claremont Institute Publius Fellow and a conservative writer whose work can be found in outlets like The American Mind, National Review, City Journal, and The American Conservative. And we're excited to launch the podcast as a new feature of this newsletter. So we wanted to kick off the first episode of this podcast by discussing a controversy that touches on a lot of the issues in the National Populist Newsletter wheelhouse. And it's related to a bit of trouble that Nate got himself into on Twitter last week. Nate, do you want to explain what happened?
So I did get myself in a little bit of trouble last week on Twitter, as I am wont to do sometimes. I posted a picture of a reading from the conservative intellectual Sam Francis, who is recently deceased, quite controversial in his time for a variety of reasons that we can get into. But it was written in 1993. It's part of an essay that he wrote called Beautiful Losers, all about what he called the failure of the American conservative movement. And the fact that it was written in 1993, I thought was really, really prescient. So I'm going to share the passage with you guys right now, and then we'll go over what exactly I got myself into on Twitter by sharing it. So this is the paragraph that I shared. It remains possible today to rectify that error by a radical alteration of the right strategy, abandoning the illusion that it represents an establishment to be conserved. A new American right must recognize that its values and goals lie outside and against the establishment, and that its natural allies are not in Manhattan, Yale, and Washington, but in the increasingly alienated and threatened strata of Middle America. The strategy of the right should be to enhance the polarization of Middle Americans from the incumbent regime, not to build coalitions with the regime's defenders and beneficiaries. Moreover, since Middle America consists of workers, farmers, suburbanites, and other non- or post-bourgeois groups, as well as small businessmen, it is unlikely that a new right will make much progress in mobilizing them if it simply repeats the ideological formulas of a now long-defunct bourgeois elite and its order. The more salient concerns of post-bourgeois Middle Americans that a new right can express are those of crime, educational collapse, the erosion of their economic status, and the calculated subversion of their social, cultural, and national identity by forces that serve the interests of the elite above them and the underclass below them, but at the expense of the middle class. A new right, positioning itself in opposition to the elite and the elite's underclass ally, can assert its leadership of alienated Middle Americans and mobilize them in radical opposition to the regime. So that was the quote I shared. But what got me into trouble is the fact that Jonah Goldberg, my former boss, full disclosure, someone who's I think is probably familiar to a lot of readers of the National Populist Newsletter, a pretty well-known never Trump conservative writer, commentator, etc., replied to the passage that I shared and said, Sam Francis was brilliant. He was also a dangerous crank who ended his days railing about interracial TV commercials. Worth keeping that in mind. And I replied to that, yep, a brilliantly insightful man with some very ugly views on race. Now, I thought these were, relatively uncontroversial things to say at the time, but they provoked sort of a firestorm that turned into this days-long debate because some, I don't exactly know what to call them. We're talking about people like Scott Greer and these other big accounts that, Groypers or alt-right people or people who sort of, align with Francis's controversial views on race and race relations in America, were quote tweeting us and dunking on us and basically criticizing
Populist
us.
Inc. is what you are. Populist.
Right. Well, this is, yes, that was another line of critique as well. But the basic point is Francis is controversial because he did have these views on race that are sort of unacceptable today, and were even unacceptable when he was writing in the 90s. He was, like Jonah mentioned, he was against interracial marriage. He was against race mixing in general. He saw his brand of conservatism as explicitly and exclusively speaking for the white working and middle classes. and contrary to sort of any other races that belong to those classes. And there's a sort of strand of Twitter that's sort of associated with the new right types, with Scott Greer, who see themselves as the inheritors of Francis's legacy and are much more concerned with race and think of themselves exclusively as representing white people than I certainly am. And they were angry at us basically for their critique, to try to do it justice, was that, we wanted the brilliant parts of Francis, but we didn't want any of the scary stuff, right? We wanted to sort of have our cake and eat it too, where I could share a really great Francis critique of the conservative movement, while simultaneously disavowing, the parts of his critique of the conservative movement that dealt with the fact that the conservative movement was trying to cleanse itself of racist or something, right? So that was the basic critique. It turned into this massive controversy on Twitter where, for days and days, I had, people with frog emoji Twitter profile pictures tweeting angry things at me.
Of course.
But it exposed, I think, some interesting questions that the new right has to deal with that Anthony and I thought would be interesting to get into.
Yeah, and the reason why I think that Sam Francis specifically opens up this sort of questioning is because of how he is regarded in this movement called the New Right. And essentially what it is, it birthed from the 2016 election, where we saw a radical transformation of how a Republican conservative was structuring his platform, the issues that he was focusing on, how he was approaching them. And essentially what this new right is doing is it's becoming this outgrowth in a way to think about these issues like trade, like on immigration and other things, in a philosophical way. And the thing is that it's because it's only beginning to take shape that you see a lot of people, as you said, Nate, who are trying to say that they are the true inheritors of the philosophy, and we need to preserve it in its whole purity, right? We have to accept the critiques that Sam Francis is doing, which are, as you said, they are brilliant, but we also have to keep his views on race, which are absolutely bad. They should not be embraced. We sort of had the same sort of question with ad nauseum with the founding fathers last year. We saw this about how to view them in regards to the greatness of them starting and founding a new nation, a constitution, on the view of ordered liberty, what its purpose was. But how do we reconcile all that with their view on slavery, right? There's views that they had that we have to square and reject, knowing where we have come thus far. But there's a way to frame these figures. There's a way to be nuanced. And in Sam Francis's case, as the new right continues to develop its own intellectual roots, we have to be careful in how we're analyzing these people. And this is why we need to carefully and be thoughtful. And when we read figures like Sam Francis, while we're also simultaneously rejecting the views on race, which are things that should not be welcomed into the new right intellectually.
Right. So this is one of the tensions that I think was exposed by this little Twitter tiff that I got into with the Groyper corners of Twitter, which is that, Sam Francis's views on race are views that we don't want to embrace, at least. But at the same time, he was someone who was a genius, and he's someone that the kind of politics that he was advocating and the kind of critiques of the conservative movement that he was making in the early 90s are ones that, young conservatives like Anthony and I are just coming around to now. And it's amazing to read his critiques, and he was brilliant in all these important ways. So it's this tension we're struggling with, where we're trying to try to figure out how we can think about someone like Sam Francis and incorporate a lot of his writing into our political project, this developing thing that people are broadly calling national populism or the new right or what have you, without embracing the sort of uglier views of race that he has. And the people who were dunking on me for saying this were arguing that you can't separate the two from one another. You can't have the sort of acceptable mainstream stuff without the unacceptable racial views. And that's, I think, the question that we're trying to sort of like figure out and we're trying to work through.
Right. It effectively prevents any sort of nuance in the conversation.
Precisely. Right. Or I think one of the arguments that people were making was that, his view of, trying to restrict interracial marriage, for example, was crucially important to his larger critique of mass modern society. You can't separate the two from one another. Now, I don't agree with that, and Anthony doesn't either. But it's a point that is worth engaging with. And I think this approach to sort of thinking about these issues, I think, is why Francis feels so revelatory to us, right? Because his critiques of the conservative movement, are incredibly cogent, right? He in the same essay, one of the things that he wrote was he's critiquing William F. Buckley and National Review, and he's saying, what this old right failed to recognize is that they weren't trying to prevent a revolution that was coming. The revolution had already happened. There already was this instantiated modern regime made up of everything from the universities to the Democratic Party to the entrenched bureaucracy in DC. And the fact that the old right thought of themselves as a part of that establishment rather than part of middle America leading a counterinsurgency against that establishment was what was wrong with their framing of politics in America. And this is a view that, the new right is coming around to now. I think it's a view that Ryan shares, and it's certainly one that Anthony and I share. But it's fascinating that Sam Francis was talking about this in the early 90s, and it makes him sort of a prophet in our view. And I think you can agree with that while not embracing the sort of uglier racial views that Francis talked about. People like him and Pat Buchanan and these other sort of people who are broadly thought of as paleo-conservatives who are inspirational to those of us on the modern new right, were way ahead of their time. And they basically set the stage for what folks like Ryan and the National Populist Newsletter and, Claremont, where I'm working this summer, and this variety of other sort of new right think tanks and advocacy groups are trying to do now. And the political project that we're advancing, I think, can take a lot from people like Francis and Buchanan without embracing, I think, the parts of Francis's views of race that I think are not something that we want to incorporate into our political project. So one of the big questions, I think, that is raised by this consideration of this really controversial figure like Sam Francis and his place in conservatism broadly, and specifically for our purposes, the new right, is the big questions, right, are the ones like that Anthony touched on earlier, like how are we supposed to think of just historical figures in general in America, the American founders, Lincoln, et cetera, people who have views that now, by sort of modern standards, we find broadly unacceptable for the American mainstream, but we still think should be venerated and were great men. That's the big debate that's happening in America, and we're all familiar with that debate. But in the context of our movement, how are we to think about someone like Sam Francis, right, who has views that aren't acceptable in the conservative mainstream today? And how are we supposed to think of the history of the conservative movement in general, right? William F. Buckley is a figure that I think, I have a lot of reverence for, but Francis is vehemently critical of Buckley, and I think it offers critiques that are worth taking seriously, because William F. Buckley famously sort of cleaned up the conservative movement as it was coming into existence in the first place, and banished, things like the John Birch Society and all these kooks and cranks who had, unacceptable views on race or were anti-Semitic or, were just sort of crazy for a variety of different reasons. And Buckley was sort of the gatekeeper of the conservative movement, where he decided that people who had views like Francis's on race, for example, weren't allowed in this sort of quote unquote respectable conservative movement that he was trying to build. Now, there's a convincing argument to be made that was an important tactic to try to, mainstream the conservative movement and get to a point where, conservative politicians could be logging big victories and conservatism could be an acceptable mainstream ideology. But Francis makes the case that I think is worth taking seriously, that there's also a lot lost in sacrificing a lot of thinkers who had ideas that at the very least were worth taking seriously, and were considered unacceptable in sort of polite conservative society. And that's obviously still a big issue of debate today, right? As we saw it play out in miniature in this Twitter debate that we had last week, where the Jonah Goldberg's comment sparked this explosive days-long Twitter debate about whether or not Sam Francis's racial views were acceptable for conservatives, whether or not they should be part of conservatism, et cetera, et cetera. And speaking of someone like Jonah, this is obviously a bigger debate on the right in terms of the never-Trumpers, right, who conceive of themselves as continuing Buckley's gatekeeping project by being quote-unquote principled conservatives and rejecting Trump and sometimes Trump's entire voter base. And other people push back, and I think this is sort of where the new right positions itself and say, no, like these people belong in our coalition. We've been spending so much time trying to gatekeep for so long. We've lost these people who should be our natural allies. So, Francis was, again, bringing up these questions that we're just now rediscovering, not necessarily on the questions of race, but on the questions of like who belongs in the conservative movement and what the conservative movement should stand for, that are really interesting and are worth considering.
Right. And this is one thing I think that the new right is actually trying to do with its newly formed coalition that it's building, because it's not just one strain of conservatism that it consists of. It's all different, ideological preferences that people have in this coalition. And I think that there is, when you talk about gatekeeping, there is a difference between gatekeeping and the narrowness of the gate itself. When you have a large gate, then you have a broad group of people that can enter into that gate to be able to participate in this debate. And I think that's worth saying, because there is something to the idea of being able to include a large section of people into this debate so that we can have so that there is a necessary good movement on things, and embracing views that should not be welcomed into the gate. I think that's a noteworthy distinction. And the one thing is like that's happening on this realignment, I think it's worth noting, is that the part of the realignment means bringing in more working class non-whites, appealing to them by moving left in some places on economics while committing to a more assertive stance on cultural issues. And that's the kind of politics advanced by Sam Francis, who, at least towards the end of his career, saw that projects as inseparably tied to the white working class exclusively. And because progressives and some Cato Institute style libertarians and neoconservatives accuse people on the new right for being racist to support something like immigration restrictions, generally speaking, we obviously reject that label. And ironically, our brand of conservatism is much more attractive to non-whites than corporate consultant Paul Ryan style libertarianism. But there is a small but vocal portion of the very online new right, the Scott Greer, the Groypers, who consider themselves inheritors of Francis's legacy and argue that the racial element has to be a part of that. And one thing that is noteworthy to say even is that in Sam Francis's analysis, in that essay that you were referencing, Nate, is he talks about where the old right went wrong in its intelligentsia focus, Manhattan-based ivory tower focus in the conservative movement, while alienating specific people in Middle America that weren't able to really jive with the perspective that it was coming from, both religiously and culturally and intellectually. And he explicitly stated that there's a whole opportunity for a new right to seize upon. I wanted to read one quote from that specific essay. He says, "Instead of the uselessness of the Diogenes search for an honest presidential candidate or Fabian quest for a career in the bureaucracy, a middle American right should begin working with schools, churches, clubs, women's groups, youth organizations, civic and professional associations, local government, the military and police forces, and even in the much dreaded labor unions to create a radicalized middle American consciousness that can perceive the ways in which the exploitation of the middle classes is institutionalized and understand how it can be resisted. Only when this kind of infrastructure of cultural hegemony is established, or developed rather, can a middle American right seek meaningful political power without coalitions with the left and bargaining with the regime." And this is essentially what the National Populist Movement's doing. This is what Ryan Girdusky is doing in his efforts with the 1776 Project PAC. He's trying to focus on these local areas to have meaningful change, not negotiate or try to compromise our first principles with the people who are in the regime. That's the whole point. And there is something to that. There is something to focusing on that. But just because of one's failure, as Sam Francis says, in the old right to fully understand this middle American Protestant group that should be looked to as this is our constituency. They failed in some ways in their intelligentsia movement. And that's a nuance that we should be able to have in the new right. That's a nuance that we should be able to accept that critique, but separate that from the bad racial views that one has, like Sam Francis.
That's exactly right. And I think, any approach to this political project that's actually going to be effective is going to recognize those nuances. And it's also going to recognize the tensions and the complexities and the fact that, embracing some aspects of the brilliant insights that Francis has is something that the new right should be shooting for. But embracing Francis's entire worldview can lead down some pretty ugly paths pretty quickly. And I think most of us, would agree that that's not somewhere that the new right should go for a variety of different important reasons. So, we don't have perfect solutions. We're not going to solve these issues on the podcast today. But we do think that Francis is someone that everyone should read, particularly everyone that's interested in our brand of conservatism, even if we don't agree with everything he's saying. I think there's something to be said about what he said about gatekeeping. It's true that conservatives are way too scared of being called racists all the time and spend a disproportionate amount of their time obsessing about gatekeeping their own movement. The left never does this. Last I checked, Ilhan Omar was still on the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Right.
And the Twitter controversy that we were talking about was illustrative of this problem on the right. I should take some responsibility here. Both Jonah and my comments were examples of that built-in, immediate, knee-jerk conservative reaction of, well, we have to make sure that everyone knows we disavow his racist views, of course. And as much as I thought all the big Groyper adjacent accounts mobbing me for that were unserious clowns for the most part, it did make me step back and think, like, why did I feel this burning necessity to explicitly clarify that I disavowed Francis's views, despite the fact the passage I posted had, really nothing to do with race? Why can't we just share good ideas and reject bad ideas rather than having this constant neurotic obsession with making sure that everyone knows we're not bigots, right? This doesn't mean that we should be racist or tolerate real and serious racism when it comes up. Of course, I mean, this should go without saying. But it does mean that we need to understand the left is always going to call us racist Nazis, regardless of what we do. They've been calling everyone to the right of Bill Kristol racist Nazis for at least decades now, probably longer than that. And we should instead be prioritizing moving forward with trying to deliver for the American people rather than obsessing over respectability. And I think that alone is a reason to take someone like Francis's critique of the sort of conservative gatekeeping seriously.
And I think that's precisely what Ryan Gerdusky is doing with the National Populist brand, including this newsletter. It's moving forward for the work of the American people, for their interest. That's all that matters. And to constantly qualify and clarify isn't getting us anywhere. Instead, focusing on the groundwork to do what needs to be done. So we encourage everybody to subscribe to this newsletter and to follow Ryan's latest projects, including his endeavor to take back school boards with the 1776 Project PAC. It all starts in places like here. So with that, until next time on the National Populist Newsletter podcast, I'm Anthony Leonardi with Nate Hochman, and thank you for listening.